Today, I want to talk about the pros and cons of living a life of extreme discretion, not really sharing any of your secrets with anyone, and not making yourself vulnerable to anyone. Before I proceed with discussing this subject, I just want to put out a couple disclaimers just to bear in mind as I'm going through this material. Number one, and this might be the most important one, is subjects like this are super subjective. There's a lot of gray area. So just take a lot of this with a grain of salt and understand that there's going to be sort of exceptions to everything. Every circumstance is different. Everyone's life is different. Everyone's mind is different. The second thing to keep in mind while going through this video today is I'm going to use the word relationship a lot. And when I use relationship, just assume for the purpose of this video that this means any and every type of relationship, from friend to family to professional to platonic to romantic. Relationship, for the purpose of the video today, simply and powerfully means a connection between any two people. So the subject of living a very discreet life versus living an open life with a lot of vulnerability are two very different ways of living. I have bounced quite a lot between both different ways of living myself for different reasons, which I'll touch on a little bit today, or at least touch on my experiences of both and some observations I've made. So if we look at this as a spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, you have extreme discretion and secrecy, one might say, where you really don't share anything too personal about yourself with anyone. And we'll call the other end of the spectrum extreme oversharing, which is where you just never stop talking about whatever the hell is going on in your head. You're just letting your thoughts spill out to other people. Now, somewhere between these two sides of the spectrum, I think, is the ideal way to live and the ideal way to be. You're going to fluctuate towards one end of the spectrum versus the other, depending on the circumstance, depending on what's going on with you, depending on what your triggers are, or perhaps even just the way you're predisposed. I know some people that are extremely discreet and they don't really like sharing any part of their personal life with really anyone. And that's very consistently who they are. I know some people that are just total oversharers. They share stuff that they should definitely keep to themselves, details with people that those people don't really want to know. They don't put a lot of thoughts into kind of knowing your audience, as it's said, before sharing information. And as I mentioned previously, I've kind of fluctuated between both ends of the spectrum, even the extreme sides of the spectrum, within the last few years. So what I'd love to do is share some of my personal experiences and anecdotes from operating on both sides of this spectrum. And then after that, I'll share just some general sort of pros and cons of each way of being that might prove useful to you. Starting on the oversharing side of the spectrum, I know for me, I found myself guilty a lot of times of oversharing in the past and sharing stuff that I regret sharing with people. And I think the reason that I've done this and the reason why some people might overshare is sort of like a social insecurity, which is a little ironic because usually social insecurities are born out of the fear of being embarrassed or experiencing shame. Meanwhile, oversharing is one of the surest ways to lead yourself to embarrassment and shame in public situations. But I think for me, it's been tempting to sort of use oversharing very personal things as a way to sort of just bust through the social distance and barriers between people, just to sort of like break the ice with something that's so personal, that's so weird or crazy that it just kind of takes all the pretense and sort of the fakeness and inauthenticity out of the room or out of a conversation. And sometimes this can work quite well, actually, to really sort of disarm people, because it's like, wow, okay, this person is not afraid to let it all hang out there. So maybe I can share a little bit about myself. And then, when two people share personal things, when two people are vulnerable, this is when a connection is formed and a relationship is formed or relationship is strengthened. However, I think there is a difference between oversharing and being vulnerable that's largely born out of intent and the amount of security you have within yourself and your intention when you're in that sort of scenario. So oversharing out of a insecurity thing to try to sort of get attention and bridge gaps and sort of put the spotlight on yourself as a means to sort of allay your social insecurity is actually not super authentic. And there's this weird sort of way that you can share some really personal, intimate details about yourself while still keeping your actual emotional vulnerability and access to your emotions behind a wall, if that makes sense. And I think sometimes people do this, especially when they're sharing about their trauma with someone. There's a way that you can sort of speak about it like you're reading an article about someone else's life, even though it's about you, and you're sort of exposing your words and your story to another person, but you're not really letting yourself emotionally connect with it or to emotionally open yourself up to that person while you're sharing this. I've definitely found myself doing this in the past. Versus, I think, authentically being vulnerable with someone versus oversharing. I think it's more intentional, one might say, where for one thing, you're choosing the right person and the right timing. You're not just injecting some inappropriate personal anecdote into the middle of a dinner party. Instead, it may be more intimate circumstances. You're having a one-on-one conversation with someone and they may say or do something that makes you think of that personal anecdote. And this creates sort of a very real opportunity to be vulnerable. And this vulnerability is sort of opening a door and giving someone trust and allowing them to do the same if they want to, or at least to feel heard and understood by you sharing something about yourself that sort of connects with or relates to what was happening in the conversation or something that they shared, perhaps. On the other end of the spectrum, extreme discretion, not sharing anything. This can be very tempting, and it has been for me in the past when you may go through a period of your life where you feel sort of like you're losing control and your life is being manipulated by a lot of outside influence. This may be family and friends. It may be unintentional. It may be well-intentioned. It probably isn't malicious, but sometimes just in a bid to claw back control and really not have anyone interfere with your life or manipulate any circumstances around you, you may decide, as I have at times in the past, to just sort of shut everyone out of your inner world and what's really going on with you, what you really think, what you really feel, what you've done. Not necessarily done like bad things, but maybe bad things. And as I said, in the short term, this can be nice because it does give you more control, because without any personal information about you, people can't really respond to put any thoughts in your head about how to look at a situation or how to respond to it. They can't talk to anyone else about it, which may, through a series of people rumoring or gossiping, sort of manipulate or influence a circumstance that you might have in your life. So that can be nice to sort of put a plug in that and take back that control, take away the opportunity for other people to do that. But I think that's really where the benefit ends. I think this is typically done out of that desperate bid for control. But there is a steep price to shutting yourself off from everyone, sort of keeping your internal world just to yourself, not being vulnerable with anyone. And that ultimate price is loneliness. And I found, after operating in this very discreet way of living for a few months, that I found myself growing increasingly more isolated, feeling disconnected from people that I love. unable to establish or form new relationships or connections. And this does lead to loneliness, which leads to depression, anxiety, a lot of ruminating and kind of just circular thinking that you're lost and stuck in your own head by yourself. And my struggle has been with either end of the spectrum, or really any of the sort of stuff that I talk about on this channel, is that I tend to always be operating my life under some sort of ideology that I have established for myself that is influenced by life circumstance, videos I've seen, self-help books, whatever. And I'll sort of establish a new mode of being that I get very sort of rigid and dogmatic about. And as I'm saying this, I'm sort of realizing maybe one of my biggest problems with all this stuff is flexibility, because I think any way of living, any rule of how to be sort of has an asterisk with some exceptions at the bottom of the page that you have to take into account. And I think just in general, flexibility is a good thing to bring into any way of living. Anyways, off on a little tangent there. What I'd now like to do for the purpose of argument, or the purpose of the conversation, is to just run through a few of the reasons in which you might find yourself deciding to live with a high degree of discretion and secrecy, one might say, sort of shutting everyone out from your inner world. I already mentioned control, that is self-control. And by self-control in this case, I mean taking any control away from other people over your life. That is one of the benefits of living this way. Although, as I said, I think it is sort of short-lived. I also think it's naive to think that any of us can truly live without the influence and control at times of other people in this world. But in the short term, this can be a benefit of it, of sort of just taking back control and influence over your everyday life and decision making. Another benefit that can come about from living discreetly is you can develop a bit of a reputation as being a safe person to tell things to, a confidant, if you will, because people may assume that if you keep your own business locked down so tightly, you will keep theirs as well. However, as I will touch on in a little bit, I think that as you spend more time around the people you know being so discreet, although you may have a reputation of being a good confidant, people may feel uncomfortable opening up to you because you never open up to them. So it sort of becomes an emotional one-way street. Another potential benefit of living a very discreet life is that because you are not willing to share a lot of your true thoughts, feelings, emotions, what's really going on with you, you probably won't be involved in a lot of confrontations or be associated with anything controversial. Additionally, with this lack of sharing with other people, you sort of inherently create very powerful social boundaries, which keeps anyone from getting too close to you, which a nice side of that is you really reduce your likelihood of being hurt by someone, even though I would argue that the cost of this is that you end up hurting yourself through loneliness. And with that, I will segue into more of the pros and cons of living a more open life, somewhere we'll say in the middle third of the spectrum in between oversharing and extreme discretion. So I talked about loneliness and isolation, which can come about from being too discreet and too secretive. So holding on to these things, having this very active inner world that never gets shared with another person, it can give you this extreme loneliness and isolation in a couple different ways. One of the ways is that human relationships and connections, I don't know why I'm saying human. It's not like I ever talk about anything other than humans yet. Relationships and connections are created and generally catalyzed by two people sharing something vulnerable about each other, or about themselves, rather. And this sharing of vulnerability creates an authentic moment, an authentic connection. It's not just giving information, it's giving trust. And authenticity plus vulnerability plus trust equal a potentially very good relationship. The other thing that can happen too, that can lead to loneliness and isolation when you don't share any of your inner world with another person, is that you can get really stuck in your head, because your head gets full of all of this stuff that's going on with you, and you have no sort of release valve. And well, I do think it's good for us to be able to let things go and release things on our own that we may be ruminating about. It can be much easier and more cathartic to let go or release stuff that's going on in our heads by sharing about it or talking about it with a safe person. There's a really interesting benefit of being willing to be vulnerable and share with another person that's very practical. And that is by opening up to someone and creating these stronger relationships. This can actually really be beneficial for your career. And I didn't expect to really be talking about anything career or professional related in this conversation, but it sort of came to me as I was working on my notes for this video. And I reflected back across my career, and starting in my early 20s, I started making some really big jumps every 2 to 3 years leading to where I am now. And all the big career jumps I made had really nothing to do with my college education or really my prior work experience. Some of it had to do with my innate soft skills, but where the true opportunities for promotion really came about was having some very vulnerable, authentic moments with either my boss at the time or the owner of a business, where we're just sort of having this very informal, human to human moment, sharing some really personal stuff and sort of just blasting through the sort of formal, emotional walls up, safety barricades up way that we sort of show up in our professional settings, especially. And by just bridging across all of that, I was able to create some very close relationships with these people, which led to really big career advancement. That's not why I did that. I like connecting with people. I like being close to people. And that sort of organically led to that. But reflecting back, I can see the impact that had on my career advancement and those opportunity doors being opened. And I do think that's something that could be done with a little bit more intentionality. However, be careful to not lose your authenticity by focusing too much on that outcome when you're in those circumstances. I think that's all I have to say today about exploring the consequences of living a life of extreme openness and oversharing versus extreme discretion and secrecy, and trying to find the sweet spot somewhere in the middle. I would love to hear any thoughts that you have about this subject. If you feel very strongly one way or another about this, if you disagree with me entirely, that's totally fine too. I always love hearing new perspectives. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.